Welcome to the Highland Heights Sunday morning Bible class series. We are glad that you're joining us. We say it every week. We hope that very soon we are back in person. But until then, we will continue having our conversation series here, and we're glad you joined us. We are recording this during the great winter weather storm of 2021.
COVID 21.
Yeah. Snowpocalypse. It's really bad. But anyway, we hope that everyone's staying. I guess James tells us not to say this, but warm and well fed. Can I say that?
So yeah, well,
I hope that you actually are warm, staying inside and staying safe as well. So if you haven't been with us in a while, we've been going through a series of different individuals in Scripture asking questions of God. So far, we're 6 or 7 weeks in, and we've stayed in the Old Testament pretty much the entire time. We'll get to a few New Testament individuals in the next few lessons, but tonight we're ending out the Old Testament. Last week we went through Jonah and talked through some of his questions, and tonight we are going to another minor prophet, just 3 chapters, Habbakuk, and some of the questions that he had for God. And one of the benefits of Habbakuk is that we get the exact question and we get the exact answer that God gives to Habbakuk. So, Jeremy, why don't you start us off at the beginning? Where does Habbakuk lead in his questions?
Well, with Habakkuk, you are, as you said, you're dealing with one of the minor prophets who is prophesying during a time when the people of Judah, it's the divided kingdom, the people of Judah are not doing what they ought to be doing. Okay, they're not living as the people of God. And in fact, they're doing a lot of the things that are going to get them taken into exile. And what's interesting is they're worshiping idols, but in addition to the idol worship, there's other things. It's interesting, as we're going to see in just a second, Habakkuk doesn't even bring up idol worship, really, when he's questioning God. He brings up other things, okay? And so Habakkuk has this complaint, he has this question, and Michael, as you pointed out, God answers him. God says this is so, we're not having to read in and say, okay, what was the question? What were they thinking? What might God's answer be? No, God gives us an answer. Although interestingly, as we'll see, it's not the answer that Habakkuk's expecting, and it's not the answer that we might be expecting. So Habakkuk starts with his very first question, or in my Bible, the heading is actually complaint. He says, "O Lord," beginning in chapter 1 and verse 2, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." Okay, so what he's worried about is the perversion of justice. They're not acting like the people of God. They're not acting like they should be acting as the people of God. And like we said, God has an answer. So Habakkuk is saying, God, do you care? Are you interested in doing justice? Do you care about the injustice your people are doing? And God, I love God's response. "Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told." How would you feel if that's, you ask a question to God, God says, "I'm about to tell you something you're not going to believe." That's kind of scary, God. Just wait. "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans." The who? The Chaldeans. And by the way, listen, we don't have to wait for Habakkuk's description. Look at how God introduces them. "That bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God." And that last phrase, we'll come back to that last phrase. Okay. So don't worry about it, Habakkuk. I'm going to send the Babylonians, and they're going to conquer you. I'm sorry, God, you're going to do what? And Habakkuk, I love this. Habakkuk doesn't go, "Okay, that's weird, but thanks," and go on. he actually goes to God and says, but God, they're wicked. Okay. Verses 12, 1:12 through 2:1, he takes another complaint, and I love what he says in 2:13. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and are silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? I mean, God, look, we're not great, but surely we're better than them. We're your people, and yet you're going to send them. God, how can you use an impure agent? And let's pause here and be honest. Who else is he going to use? I mean, who else is God going to use to chastise his people but an impure agent when his people are being impure? And so God comes back with an answer in the rest of chapter 2. And what he basically tells Habakkuk is that, don't worry, I've got this under control. And the Chaldeans are not going to be held guiltless. Okay. I will judge them. Okay. God says he will judge the proud. That idea of pride keeps coming up in Habakkuk over and over and over again. And again, at the end of 1:11, he says that the Babylonians are guilty men whose own might is their God. Okay. We remember some of the stories from the book of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king that was that God's talking about here in Habakkuk, who's going to come conquer the people of Judah. And how God humbled him. Remember, there's the story where Nebuchadnezzar has the dream of the great and mighty tree that gets chopped down, and Daniel doesn't want to interpret it because it's God telling Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to be humbled. And then Nebuchadnezzar is looking out over the city of Babylon and goes, wow, what a great city I built. And a voice from heaven says, nope, you didn't build this. God did. This is not, no. And he has to live like a wild animal for 7 years. Okay. And that may be part of what God is dealing with here, is this idea of pride comes up continuously. God will take care of his will, he's telling Habakkuk. And I love Habakkuk's response. Habakkuk's response is, I will wait upon the Lord. The last part, the chapter 3 of Habakkuk, is his prayer takes the form of a psalm, and he calls for God's action. He reminds us of the power of God. In verses, the second part of verse 9 down through verse 15 of chapter 3, it sounds a lot like the end of the book of Job, where God is questioning Job. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging water swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped at the flash of your glittering spear. Okay. See, he's talking about the power of God. And then he expresses an acknowledgement, God, I'm still scared, but I'm going to wait on you. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how Habakkuk wrestles with this, is God says, don't worry about it. I have everything in control. I will use my agents. And Habakkuk says, okay.
Yeah. So the idea of God teaming up, if you will, or God using, so, God is the superior, and he's using obviously a kingdom that's inferior to him, but a kingdom that is superior in terms of military to God's people. It's weird to see God teaming up, to see God working alongside someone that is very much against his will. And I think that this should be humbling for us as God's people, for us as Christians, as we consider that one thing that God hates more than sinners sinning is when those who claim to be righteous sin. Revelation chapter 3 that all of us are familiar with, the lukewarm Christian, neither hot nor cold, and God wants to spit us out of his mouth. And what we see here is that God is willing to use those who are despicable to show that this self-righteousness on the part of the Israelites is not to be accepted. And so for that reason, this is a strange book. Now, we see this in other parts of Scripture as well, that God will use people that don't know him, that don't respect him, in order to further his plan. Most of the time, though, when we reflect on those, we think of Cyrus, who was God's agent to do good for him, for his people, to send them back to their land. We can think in the New Testament about the many times that Paul was able to use his Roman citizenship to rescue him in order to preach another day. Here, though, we might get a little uncomfortable with this. So the economist in me wants to put forward the classic example, and I'm kind of laughing just even thinking about presenting this in a Bible class, but I will go ahead and do it. Bootleggers and Baptists. So this is an argument that goes back to Prohibition, that there were two groups that supported the Prohibition laws. It was the people who would profit from it, and the people who felt self-righteous about it, the people who wanted to further their agenda. The difference here between God teaming up with the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, and this bootleggers and Baptist idea is that God actually sees everything that's going on. God knows that his people will not be destroyed completely. A remnant will survive, and he is still able to accomplish his work. That a king can rise up out of the remnant that lives, but at the same time, he's able to use, I'll call them the bootleggers, just the people that no one likes, that no one sees as respectable, to carry out justice in that way. One other thought, Jeremy, before I hand it back over to you, is just that I think that it would serve us well as a church, and especially, I hate to say this, millennials in the church, who care a lot about social justice, to spend more time in the minor prophets specifically, and to look at the ways that God sees power playing out in how he takes care of justice issues. Now, the whole Old Testament is filled with God taking power to those who are not fulfilling his idea of what justice really should look like. And there's no one who understands justice better than God. But the way that he takes care of it is not always the way that we want him to. And we should be prepared to be humbled ourselves as we react to what to the pure manifestation of God's justice. That he's not going to adulterate it just because he wants to make his people look good. No, if we are the ones who are not fulfilling God's role of justice in the world, then we should pray that God would take care of us. Hopefully, not pray for death necessarily, but we should pray that God will move us out of the way if we're getting in the way of him doing his will.
You know, to accept correction graciously and gracefully is one of the rare virtues that we see in the world. And what that really takes is a certain level of humility and a certain level of trust. We have this plan in our mind, right? And we talked about last week, we have a vision of who God should accept and who he should reject. And oftentimes it's not the way it goes. And, Jonah had a lot of trouble with that. We also have a view of this is the way things should work. And we often, because we so often debate good versus bad, good versus evil in relation to other people, we often don't see it in relation to God, and again, to go back to the comment I made, who else is God going to use to correct his people but an impure people, because we're all impure. Okay. So to accept that, you know what, God is going to bring his purposes, and that our goal, our desire should be his purposes, takes a great deal of trust. And what I find just endlessly fascinating is in the book of Romans, he's presenting the gospel, right? And kind of the thesis of the book of Romans. And in Romans, Paul does everything but what, an AP student who's nervous that their thesis and their essay is not going to be recognized, so they underline it. He does everything but that. Okay. In Romans 1:17, he gives kind of the thesis of the book of Romans. He says, the righteous shall live by faith. And you may notice if you look it up that that's set off as a quote. Well, that's a quote of Habakkuk 2:4. Okay. It's God is saying, behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. So he's talking about the proud, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Okay. The righteous shall live by faith. When Paul is looking for a thesis for his argument in the book of Romans and what it means to be righteous and to live by faith and to trust in the salvation of Jesus, the grace of God through Jesus, and not trust in our own works. Okay. And see, think back, a lot of the prophets, major and minor, one of the things they're dealing with is the people thought, oh, we've got the temple. We're the people of God. We're good. God won't destroy his temple because no God would allow his temple to be destroyed. So God's not going to destroy his temple. So we're safe. And God, through the prophets, is telling them, no, 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 no. The temple's a building. You're supposed to be my temple. Okay. And you need to live like it. And you also need to stop treating my temple like, a temple for whatever God you want to stick in there too. But, that's a different issue that God had with them, or a similar issue, but different from the issue of them depending on that temple. Anyway, so what Paul is doing when he's laying down that foundation for this is how you trust in God, is he's reaching back to this idea that we find in Habakkuk. And what is God telling in Habakkuk? Lean in me, especially when I don't do things the way you think I should. Lean in me when you are a Jew going, well, then why did we have the law in the first place? Lean on me when you're a Gentile saying, but I was a wicked, evil Gentile. Lean on me when you are someone who thinks you live a pretty good life. And I tell you, nope, you've sinned anyway. And the only way you can come through me is through Christ. That's the kind of faith that Habakkuk is really pointing us to, is a faith that looks at God when God is chastising, is punishing in a way that we're like, but why? What about? There's what about? There's a little bit of whataboutism. God says, I'm going to bring the Chaldeans, and Habakkuk says, well, but what about the way that they live? And God says, I know, I'll take care of that. I got it. Habakkuk, I'll take care of that. But the people of Judah need to be chastised. And the people of Judah are the ones that are called to a higher standard. Okay. And again, Habakkuk at the end of the book, he comes and he says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vine, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herds in the stalls. Well, sounds fun, doesn't it? Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. That's where Habakkuk ends up, is disaster falls, yet will I trust in the Lord. Okay. And again, Habakkuk has the benefit of God telling him, this is what I'm doing. But even then, Habakkuk is saying, he's saying, you know what? When the disaster falls, even though I'm not going to enjoy it, I will still rest upon the word of the Lord.
Yeah, it's one of the blessings that we should understand, right? That even though we can't, in the same way, ask our questions directly of God, we have the benefit of seeing from the outside what's going on here in Scripture, that we get to read the end at the same time that we get to read the beginning, right? We can read the completeness of what's going on here. And it's a blessing for us as Christians to see the arc of what God is seeking to accomplish with his people in the Old Testament, leading them to Christ, and that Christ appears throughout all of the things that God says. And so knowing what God is hoping to do with his people, we can also make the same judgments about our own lives, about his church today, that we know what God is looking to do with his church. And I would say that God still has a justice mission in what he's seeking to do in the world today. And he wants to do it through the church, just as he wanted to do it through his people back then. And if we're not ready to do it, he can do it without us. God can destroy his people then, and he can make us irrelevant today if we're getting in the way of God accomplishing his mission and bringing people to him. And once again, that should be our prayer. Jeremy, I want to ask you a question, kind of going back to chapter 2, verse 4, and its tie to the book of Romans. Mm-hmm. So I took Jimmy Allen for Romans, which even outside of Harding circles, he is known for. The old joke was that he was around when Paul wrote it, so he might have had given a few thoughts on the way that it was written. Anyway, he passed. I think he passed away maybe last year, but very recently. We spent a long time on this connection here. And tell me what you think about this. I'm trying to remember to the best that I can on some of his commentary here. And so the idea is that in Habakkuk, the concentration, what God is saying here is that the righteous shall live. That there is, for those who follow after God, who seek to do his will, life is promised. That he is not going to destroy those who are not righteous. And the way that you show that righteousness is by faith. Whereas when Paul takes the quotation, he turns it a little bit. Now it's the same words. He doesn't change the wording at all. But the emphasis seems to be different, that the righteous shall live by faith, and that there's more of an emphasis on faith and how that plays into what it means to be righteous. And so faith is more important than life itself. Life is only a precursor to faith. That life, the point of life is to emphasize the faith that we have in God, and therefore that's what makes us righteous. I'm curious, reactions there. I didn't prep you on this. How do you see the two books using this verse?
Love that you want me to respond to Jimmy Allen and what he
live
with no prep whatsoever. No, I would not necessarily separate the two, life and faith. Okay. I think there are subtle shades of difference because Habakkuk is writing in the middle of the story. Paul is writing about the climax of the story, and the climax of the story is, of course, Jesus. Okay. Here we're talking about the entire story of salvation. So, Paul's got more information than Habakkuk does. Okay. In other words, Paul's got a little bit more information on why the people needed to be purified, right? Why the nation of Judah needed to be purified and needed to go through this refiner's fire than Habakkuk would have, because Habakkuk was writing before the refiner's fire came. Okay. Having said that, though, we live the way we do because we trust that God's way is the best way, even or perhaps especially when it doesn't look like it. See, we want to do things our way, and sometimes I think we get a little bit far out over our skis on this one, and that's appropriate in a snowstorm, and maybe even get a little prideful in that we think, okay, this is what God is doing, and we're right about what God is doing, so this is the way I think it will get there. And maybe there are times when we're right, but we pursue that path for longer than God intended that path to be pursued. The Babylonian Empire did its job. It took the people of Judah away into captivity for 70 years like God wanted to. And then when that time was up, justice delayed is not justice denied, Babylon fell. Okay. And the Persians came in, and the Persians let the Jews go back home. And the Persians fulfilled their role in God's plan. And then the Persians fell to Alexander the Great, and the Greeks fulfilled their role in God's plan. And then they fell to Rome, and then Rome fulfilled its role in God's plan, and then Rome fell. Okay. God's plan is what was important there. And that, I think, is where where we get in. I think where both Paul and Habakkuk are both maybe emphasizing it in a little different ways, but emphasizing this idea of it's God's will that drives this. It's God's plan that drives this. It's God's grace that drives this. Okay. And so, in Romans, we often talk about how in Romans, Paul talks about we have to live by faith, and you can't earn salvation. And that's very true. We can't earn salvation, but you have to stop after Romans chapter 11 to avoid the difference that salvation should make in your life. See, your faith should make a difference in your life, and go read. You don't have to go to James for that. Okay, read Romans 12 through 15. That's what Paul is saying. Is this is the difference it should make in your life. Okay, in addition to comments he makes elsewhere in the book of Romans, and Habakkuk is kind of saying, you know what, we didn't live the way we should have, and so I'm going to trust God to correct that. Okay, and that I think is a key point in all of this. Is we might ask the question, okay, who is, if we were to bring Habakkuk forward to today, who would he be talking to? A nation or the church? And I think it would be the church. I think the church is probably the better application of that. Okay. So if God, God's people today is the church, that's spiritual Israel today. God, he did it. He raised up descendants from Abraham. Okay. Not necessarily from the rocks like Jesus threatened in the book of John, but from the Gentiles, who the Jews would have thought of as less than rocks. So, he raised up spiritual descendants of Israel. Okay. And so we are the nation that is supposed to live this out. Mm-hmm. How would we respond if God said, you're not doing it the way I want you to, and so you're going to go through a period in the wilderness, you're going to go through a period of exile, you're pursuing the wrong things, you're pursuing earthly power, you're pursuing earthly power in the wrong way, you're equating the church with earthly institutions, any of those things. How would we respond? Well, I think Habakkuk would tell us to respond as Habakkuk did in chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. And even going back to 16. Look, if God has it in his plan that the church needs to go through a persecution, that the church needs to be reduced, that the church needs to become less influential in culture and society because we've gotten things out of whack. Okay, I saw a cartoon one time. It's a guy by the name of Adam Ford. Okay. And Adam Ford is the guy who originally created the Babylon Bee. He since sold it, but he originally created the Babylon Bee. So that's who we're talking about here. And there's like several panels in this cartoon. It's got three guys talking, and one's a Christian, one's not a Christian. And then there's a guy in the middle. And basically the guy in the middle, as long as it's an advantage to be a Christian, he's in the middle. And then he switches sides. And the non-Christian says, see, Christian, according to Pew Research, you've got, thus and such fewer numbers. And the Christian says, yeah, that's true. Fewer people are going to church, but I feel healthier than I have in years. Would I want us to go through a persecution like that? No. Habakkuk didn't want to go through this either. 3:16. But hopefully, I hope I would respond, and I hope we would respond by saying, you know what? I will live by faith. I will rejoice in the salvation of persecution because God is my strength. Okay. I hope that is how we would respond by faith, by saying, you know what, God, I trusted you to save me, and I trusted your power and your grace to save me, not my own works. So I'm going to trust your plan to bring about your justice, not my interpretation of it.
Yeah, there's and this is something you've been referring to. There's a humility that is needed to bring ourselves under the lordship of God, and to say, God, first to acknowledge, yes, I have a plan. I have a way I think my life should go. I have ideas about what the church should be like. But God, I know that however clever I might think my plans might be, yours are better. And to remind myself of that daily, to say, God, I put myself under your control. I want to go where your plan is leading. It's easy to say that. It's harder to do it. And I think Habakkuk is in a more difficult situation because his life is on. He doesn't know that his life will be spared in this. Who knows? He knows that there is going to be destruction because of the sin that's there. But that's the way that God will find his mission fulfilled in perhaps not quickly, but in the best way. And so to acknowledge that that refiner's fire is needed to move in the right direction is powerful. We're running up on 30 minutes. So Jeremy, we've kind of talked about how this is for the church today. What's one thought? What's the takeaway thought from Habakkuk for the questions that he asked and the way that we can think about this in our own Christian lives?
Well, I think kind of the big takeaway is, well, the way he ends the book. We've talked before, he's not a tame lion. Okay. He's not a tame God. He doesn't stay in our box. And where we get in trouble is when we elevate our box above God. It's not easy. Okay. And this is why, for example, Wayne has talked about us doing the Bible reading challenge again this year. I think that's a great challenge. I wish I could do better at it a lot of times. Life happens and it shouldn't. But I think that's a good place to start, is meditating on God and what God has done. Whenever the prophets, whenever the Psalms, whenever they talked about the punishment of God and what God wanted, they always went back to, this is what God has done. This is where God has been. And even you go read the book of Acts, when they took the gospel out, they said, this is what God has done. They just had more to the story. Okay. Stephen's sermon in Acts 7 is basically a recitation of a good chunk of Israel's history. They actually cut him off before he could finish, which was very rude.
He wanted to keep going.
Yeah, he wanted, yes, much like us, he wanted to keep going. But to look at what God has done, and then I think as we begin to take that in more and more, we'll be able to say what Habakkuk said, which was, I hear and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters into my bones, my legs tremble beneath me, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in God, the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places.
Yeah. We get to see the transformation of Habakkuk, and that's a blessing for us. And I think we should take it upon ourselves to realize that it's okay to do a double take. When we see God's plan at work in our lives, we're not always going to be on board with it immediately, but we get to ask God questions. We get to engage through the Spirit and to ask questions. God, what are you doing in my life? What are you doing in the church? And once we see that God is right, and we always do see this is where the Christian always comes out. The mature Christian always comes to chapter 3 and ends with, yes, God, I might have questioned, but this is your righteousness at play, and it is good. It is right. And that's comforting to me, to see God's prophets questioning, yet always coming around to God's way, which is, to be honest, it's a little opposite of Jonah. Jonah questions, unquestions, then re-questions again. And the Habakkuk, we get to see make that arc to being faithful and right with God at the end. So, Jeremy, I'm glad we had this conversation. It was enlightening and uplifting. And anyway, looking forward to jumping into the New Testament next week and continuing on with those questions that people ask. To everyone who joined us for these conversations, we really appreciate it. We're glad you're with us. We say it every week. We hope to be back in person soon. But until then, we'll see you here next week.